And hello, everyone. Welcome to the Study in Australia presentation. I'm Miss Tao, and I'll be walking you through tonight's presentation on Australian university information, admissions requirements, and I'll show you an example at the end of this presentation on how to get started with your search. There are 43 universities in Australia. 8 of them are in the top 100 rankings around the world. And Australia has the third highest number of international students after the UK and US. So many international students study there. Students typically choose Australia as a destination to study because they're mostly located in nice urban destinations. They have diverse student populations and they have opportunities for work after school. Some more practical reasons as to why students choose Australia are because they have an easy and straightforward application process. There is no need for testing unless you are a partial IB student. If you're a partial IB student, you will need to take the SAT or ACT. Degree programs, they usually last for about 3 years. And for some students, they like the fact that Australian degrees focus on their course of choice starting from their very first year. So, for example, if you want to study art history and you've known that you wanted to study art history, you will be diving into art history starting from the very first year of your studies. So that's very unlike the US or Canada. US or Canada is going to start you off with a more generalized course in the first and second years, and then you dive into your major. The UK, Australia, those tend to be places where you dive right into your course of choice from the very first year. I had just mentioned previously that 8 of Australia's universities are typically ranked in the top 100 universities in the world. These are the group of 8. This group is Australia's leading universities, and they are very popular among ISM students to apply to. Um, these are their locations. As you can see, they're located in mostly large cities around the country. Other popular universities that ISM students have applied to that are not in the group of 8 are listed here. So, how do I begin planning for the application process? Aussie universities are typically on a semester model, so they admit students for term start dates in February and in July. Most ISM students will aim for the February start term after they graduate, which gives them about 6 months or so of freedom before university studies start. They will apply for the Australian universities in August or September after they graduate. So, for example, when the grade 11s, so this batch of grade 11s graduates in June 2022, they will start applications for Australia in September 2022, and they apply with their final IB diploma results. Final IB diploma results typically come out in July after a student's senior year. So they actually apply in September. It's rare to find an ISM student that will apply with predicted grades for a July term start because the turnaround time from graduation and moving on into a new university gives little time for mental preparation, emotional preparation. That's the time when seniors are usually saying goodbyes. Maybe their families are also transitioning. So we haven't had as many students apply for a July start date. The usual is usually for a February start date. So that's just something to keep in mind and to consider if you're thinking about doing a July start date. Um, if you do plan on doing the February start term, like most ISM students do, you will have a 6-month gap period before starting university. So that gap period allows you to participate in, a gap semester program or in an internship. You might want to travel or find a part-time job. Whatever it may be, it does allow you to explore and transition before university starts. So those are some of the benefits to that. So what kind of Australian universities, I'm sorry. So what are Australian universities looking for in terms of application requirements? If you're an IBDP student, they will first go to your final IB exam results to determine your eligibility. So you don't need to take any extra exams. They just base it off of your IB diploma final results. And you just submit it through the online application, and that's it. They look to see if your total IB score result matches their requirements. If you're a partial IB student, you will need to submit your final IB certificate scores and a supporting ACT or SAT score because you are technically applying as a US high school diploma holder. So that's why they ask for those ACTs or SATs. In addition to those tests, sometimes Australian universities may also ask students for an IELTS or TOEFL for English proficiency purposes. It's either for that or for visa purposes for students who are holding passports from countries where English is not the national language or first language. Students may be exempt from these requirements if they fulfill the following. So, some universities say that they might be exempt if they have completed 5 years of study in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, or Ireland. Um, or if you're passport holders of the UK, USA, Canada, New Zealand, or Ireland. And then the last three are special circumstances. So those are ways students can be exempt from English language proficiency exams. However, if you have an international passport that is not from one of those countries listed here, they may still ask you for it, mostly for visa purposes rather than just academic purposes. Another pathway into Australian universities is through foundation programs. Foundation programs are 6 to 9 month intensive study programs that kind of guide you in solidifying study skills and content skills before you apply to an actual degree seeking program at an Australian university. So it's for students who might have not scored as well as they'd hoped for on their IB diploma for university admission, or maybe it's for students who have taken the partial IB route, but they don't plan to take the SAT or ACT, and they do not have those scores. Those would be situations where the counselor could look at foundation programs with a student to see if that would be more fitting in order to get to the degree that they're actually looking for at an Australian university. Some Australian universities have foundation programs attached to their schools. So, for example, University of Melbourne, their foundation program is called Trinity College. And so students would apply to Trinity College as their, 6 to 9 month intensive program. um, their foundation programs are built so that you achieve a certain score, and if you achieve that certain score during that foundation program, you can go straight into that degree seeking program. I know a lot of parents will ask us, well, what's the benefit of this foundation program? Isn't it just, quote unquote, wasting another year or another 6 to 9 months? No, that's not the case. Sometimes these foundation programs give students that extra year they need to sort of build upon some of the skills they've already learned in high school. And I have had experience with previous students where it's really helped solidified some skills and they score really nicely in some of these foundation programs and get into really nice universities. Universities that they might have not gotten into with just their partial IB certificates or with a lower IB diploma score than expected. So it really depends on a student. So it's a case by case thing. It's always something you can talk to your counselor about. If you're an IB diploma student, here is an example of final IB diploma score requirements for the group of 8 schools. So as you can see, I'll just pick out a random major here, business. Business at University of Queensland, the first column there, is a 29 to 32. So a student who reaches a total IB diploma score of 29 to 32 will receive direct entry into that business degree program. Um, and this is pretty much all of the research you have to do in terms of IB admission requirements. Because if you're an IB diploma student, you do not need any sort of test scores, you do not need letters of recommendation or teacher references, nothing like that. It's very straightforward. So you look at the score band that they accept students with, so 29 to 32, and you just make sure that you focus on that academic goal, perform well in your classes, perform well in the exams, and you will be considered for that program. You may also see that on websites, Australian universities look for something called ATAR scores. So it's a different kind of grading system, but it's based off of the Australian tertiary admission rank. These are published every year, so the numbers vary and change. Um, Students do not have to worry about converting their own IB scores to an ATAR. Australian universities will do that for you. Here in this presentation, we have a rough estimate of what an IB diploma score of 45 would equate to. So that's a 99.95, or a score of 24 would equate to, and that's a 68.10. So if you are an Australian citizen, or if you're an Australian permanent resident, you will notice that universities will technically list your requirements as ATAR scores, rather than for international students where they'll list it as IB diploma requirements. And I'll show you an example of what I mean in just a moment. So here's another conversion chart, just so that you guys have an idea of what ATAR means. Okay, so the application process might look a little different, like I said, for citizens or international students. Citizens or permanent residents typically submit their applications on an online tertiary application center for each Australian state that they might be applying to. So, for example, if you are applying to Melbourne, you would apply to the Victoria Tertiary Admission Center website. If you're applying to New South Wales, you would apply to their tertiary application center website. So if your universities are in different states, you will have to make application portals for each of the states that you're interested in. Their score requirements for Australian citizens and permanent residents, like I mentioned, they're typically gauged on ATAR scores, and those the ATAR scores usually gauge how well Australian students have done that year. So your admission requirements are based off of the performance levels of domestic students. So you will be put into a pool of other domestic students and their scores. Oh, sorry. For international students, if you apply as an international student, you apply to each university individually. Universities typically advertise their guaranteed admission score requirements online way before the application even opens. So if you happen to be doing research and a university says you need a 37 IB diploma score in psychology to get in, essentially, if you've achieved a 37 total IB diploma score, the likelihood of admission is high for an international student. So my advice is for international students is to focus mainly on your academic performance if you're looking at Australia. Because you do not have entry essays, you do not have recommendation letters, you do not have personal statements. Um, you will have predicted grades, but those come out much earlier. Those are only applicable if you are applying for a July term start date. But otherwise, if you're applying to that regular February term start date, predicted grades are not involved. It's just final IB diploma grades. For Australian citizens, as you can see, you must check your application portals, look at some of the offer timelines. Your application will be put into a pool of other domestic students. In a nutshell, these are the steps to get to Australia. So you choose the country, you decide on a course, you check the entry requirements, so do your research, you apply, you'll receive your letter of offer. Whichever school you decide to apply to, you confirm your enrollment there. Then you'll start the visa application process if you're not a citizen or permanent resident, and then you plan for your arrival. Well, what about student accommodation? Australia is interesting. It says less than 10% of all students live on campus. So students are technically scattered around the city. Um, if you do look for on campus housing, it can be a very, very competitive process. Depending on the university, depending on the school, they may ask you to provide a letter of recommendation or write an essay as to why you want to stay on campus in a certain residence hall in order to compete for spots for on campus housing. Um, so, so the admission part is not as complex, but when it comes to student accommodation, they will ask you for materials that are outside of just, IB scores. So that's just something to keep in mind. For parents who are wondering, well, if there's not that much on-campus housing, where do we go to look for accommodation? And typically these universities will have offices that will help guide first-year students into finding accommodation and giving out recommendations, showing students the way in getting a place that'll be comfortable for them to live in. So no worries about that. It just depends on which university you end up matriculating into. Then you can connect with them and ask your questions about accommodation. The cost of tuition is comparable to places like the United States, Canada. For Australian citizens, it's about 10,000 Aussie dollars. For international students, it could be roughly around 39,000 Aussie dollars. And that doesn't include room and board and plane tickets. That's just tuition alone. Finally, one big thing to help your students decide, or students, if you're tuning in to help you decide, is while you're doing research, make sure that Australia is a realistic destination for you and your family? Does the timeline of applications work for you? The IBDP, the diploma program, is generally required for most direct entry programs. If you're a partial IB student, are you willing to either take the SAT or ACT? Or are you willing to start off with a foundation program to get to the university that you want to get to? Those are some of the questions you should ask yourself when you're helping each other decide. And here are some useful websites where students can get started on their research for Australian universities. But now I will turn over to another page. I'll open up another tab here and show you what searching for admission requirements for Australian universities will look like. So right now I'm looking up the University of Melbourne. And so what I'll do is I'll say, I want to find a course because I know what I want to study already. I want to study psychology. And I'll search for it. It'll come up with, a master's. Remember, we're looking for undergraduate programs. We're not looking for masters. So we'll click on psychology. And lo and behold, psychology is rated as the #1 program at Melbourne in Australia for psychology. Okay, so we're gonna look for a Bachelor of Arts in psychology. And what's nice about their websites is that they'll say, okay, who am I showing this information for? Is it a permanent resident or a citizen, or is it an international citizen? I will show you all the different versions. So I'm an Australian permanent resident. I have an international baccalaureate diploma, and I'm looking to begin studying in 2022. Show my entry requirements. And you'll see they are showing you the ATAR scores, right? That's 85. So if we go back to our little chart over here, if we look at the minimum requirement of 85, that's approximately a 30 or 31. So that's the total IB score point that they're looking for. If we go to an international citizen, IB diploma 2022, show entry requirements, it'll give you an IB score, right? So it says the lowest guaranteed entry score is a 31. So that means if you score 31, you will definitely get in. You will have a spot there waiting for you, essentially. Now, what if I'm an international citizen and I am doing the US high school diploma because that's the diploma that ISM awards you. So I click on that, show entry requirements, and it'll say something like, okay, GPA of 3.2 and an SAT score of about 1320 or ACT of about 28. So these scores are pretty straightforward, right? But the GPA is based off of an American scale. So it's usually out of 4, 3.2 out of 4. And so that's where we kind of have to gauge, okay, so an American GPA of 3.2, what is that equivalent to in the IB, right? Or with our IB score system that we have at ISM. And I would say that's approximately, and this is an approximate because a lot of different universities are going to interpret it in a different way, but it's approximately like a 32 in the IB, a 32 to 33. So that's my rough guesstimate. So you should expect to have a GPA that's, around a total of 6.0 or so, or no, a little bit less than that, like a high 5 point scale. So like a 5.7, 5.8 in our ISM GPA range. And then an SAT of 1320 or ACT 28. So that's just a guide only, though. That's what it says. It doesn't say guaranteed entry. So it might range from year to year. So you want to make sure you double check that and stay tuned. So that's your first example of how you can start your research on Australian universities. Because I understand that a lot of students are researching a lot of different kinds of universities at this time, I recommend making an Excel spreadsheet and keeping track of one, the different countries that you're applying to, and two, the different universities and their requirements. We have shown ways of researching universities in the Bearcats and Beyond seminars. So students are somewhat familiar as to how to go about looking for this information. And I encourage them to begin that organizational process of their research through an Excel spreadsheet, and that will be clearer for them and for mom and dad as well, or guardian. And if you guys have any questions, further questions, please let us know. On our HS Counseling website, we have a Q&A form that you can fill out if you have further questions about Australia and how to apply to schools. And then we will also send that form out in a link to everyone as well. So please let us know your questions there. And thank you so much for tuning in today.